Hello, welcome to the first in the 2024-2025 ALACT Speaker Series. ALACT stands for the Association for Informal Logic and Critical Thinking, and I am Donna Warren at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, Vice President of ALACT and host of this talk. I am delighted to introduce to you today Andy Norman, a professor at Carnegie Mellon and the director of the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative. He's also the author of Mental Immunity, and he's here to talk to us about why critical thinking is not enough, why it's time to rethink and rebrand the most important thing we teach. So, Dr. Norman, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Donna, and thank you all for being here. I have to say it's a real pleasure to reconnect with informal logicians and critical thinking enthusiasts. I really cut my teeth on this stuff as a young professor about 30 years ago. And since then, my career has taken a long, circuitous route that's taken me outside of academia. And along the way, I've kind of lost touch with some of my philosophical brothers and sisters. And I'm eager to reconnect and get your perspective on some of the ideas I've been working on while out in the well, I've been partially in the real world, but partially. So I'd like to speak informally, if this is informal logic after all. So I'm going to speak informally, make this a kind of a very human transaction. I want to tell a few stories and invite your questions. And I'm happy to take clarifying questions during. And I very much enjoy critical questions. But that might be best. If you have those, I'd prefer that you save those till the end, till the Q&A. And I would also like to ask for your help because I think some of the things I've discovered while out in the wilderness, the non-academic wilderness, may be of benefit to people who care a lot about teaching critical thinking, even though what I have to say today is to some degree heretical, I think. But I think you'll find that it's aligned with our core values as critical thinking enthusiasts. All right, my first story involves Fred the Flat Earther, who dies and goes to heaven. He arrives at God's inner sanctum, and he says, "God, I've been a flat earther my entire life, and now that it's over, I have to ask, is the world flat or is it round?" And God shakes his head and said, "I'm sorry to say, Fred, but the world is very, very round." Fred's face registers shock and disbelief, and then he says, "This conspiracy goes higher than I thought." So what should we say about Fred? Is his thinking uncritical? Well, hardly. In some ways, what makes it funny is that he's hypercritical. Imagine equipping Fred with some heavy-duty critical thinking skills. And by that, I mean the ability to slice and dice other people's arguments and find their flaws. Would that cure Fred of the weirdness and the wrongness of his thinking, or might it actually exacerbate the problem? If you actually study the way conspiracy theorists think, by following them in their online forums, you'll often find that they're far from uncritical people. In fact, many of them pride themselves on being more critical than thou, more critical than us. And they think to question things we would never think to question. A friend of mine actually went to a flat earth convention, went undercover as a philosopher at a flat earth convention. And he found that these so-called experts in flat earth theory have thought to ask critical questions about all kinds of things that you and I have never thought to ask. So their problem is not that they're uncritical, it's that they're uncritical about they're critical about the wrong things. In college, I gathered pretty quickly, when I went off to college, I gathered pretty quickly that critical thinking was kind of the coin of the realm, that here in academia, if your ability to think critically was highly valued. So I got pretty good at it. And it led me into to philosophy grad school. And I absorbed the ethos of critical thinking pretty deeply, got really good at slicing and dicing arguments, finding flaws in thinking. And I became kind of difficult to get along with, kind of contrary, um, so critical that I was probably less of a not the partner my partner needed, my partner then wife needed. Um, it kind of, I think it exacerbated my perfectionistic tendencies in some ways, and I ended up clinically depressed, in part because my own criticality was turned in on itself, turned in on me as a person. I actually gave up tenure at Hamilton College in part because of that clinical depression, and um, a lot of this has caused me to rethink critical thinking in some ways, in some pretty far-reaching ways, I think. So I was actually teaching critical thinking at Hamilton years and years ago, and I noticed that my students were kind of listless. And I talked with them, and I realized that in the course of several weeks, I've been helping them understand all of the kinds of fallacies there are out there, all of the ways thinking can go wrong, all of the biases that distort our thinking. And I had inadvertently communicated to them that thinking is a minefield. I had communicated to them that there are so many ways to go wrong that it's probably you're better off not even trying to think it at all. Um, I was sapping their motivation to think critically because they couldn't, because I didn't have a simple answer to the question, what does good thinking look like? I had plenty of answers to the question, what does bad thinking look like? But I didn't have any simple, helpful advice on here's what good thinking looks like. So I actually had to overhaul my approach to teaching. And over the course of years, I think it led me to a place where I have real qualms about the concept of critical thinking and the way it's channeling our efforts to promote wisdom. I think it's a well-intentioned concept and one of the best ones we have to date, but I don't think it's doing enough to help us promote wisdom and to help us filter out nonsense. Um, and even though we've been trying to promote critical thinking, trying to make it normal for over a century, our world is as full of lunacy and uncritical and bad thinking as it's ever been, and unwisdom. So I want to ask some hard questions about the concept of critical thinking, not because I'm opposed to what all of us are passionate about, but because I think there may be a better way to to think about good thinking. So first, let me problematize the concept of critical thinking. Ask yourself whether it's possible that the concept of critical thinking grows out of a naive picture of human development. I would I would I characterize that picture in the following way. We're born essentially credulous and naive, wide open to bad ideas and false ideas like Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, and that the only way we come to protect our minds from the really, really bad ideas is to develop what we call critical thinking skills. Now, I think this picture gets it wrong in part because it turns out we are born with relatively sophisticated powers for discriminating between good and bad information. We don't start from ground zero on this. In fact, there are highly evolved mechanisms in all of our minds that help us discriminate between good and bad information. And we need to understand how those mechanisms work, and we need to work with them and build on top of them, not assume that our students are simply naive blank slates that need to have critical thinking skills added. I think that when we valorize critical thinking, part of what we communicate is that the more critical you are, the better. But as Fred the Flat Earther illustrates, you can be too critical for your own good. Fred, of course, is a fictional case involving God and all the rest, but take any real case of a real conspiracy theorist. Many of them are hypercritical, and their hypercriticality does not serve them well. And so I'm concerned that we need to find a way not to inadvertently to communicate to students that they should try to become as critical as possible, because criticality has both good and bad sides, and it can be taken too far. I think that when we promote critical thinking, we're also cutting against the grain of human nature. Everybody knows at a very deep level that if you're too critical, it can damage your relationships. That good friendships are built upon kind of not fault finding, but helping one another. And so I think there's a lot of resistance on the part of our students to becoming the kind of critical thinker we ask them to become, in part because they sense at a very deep level that I might pay social costs if I go too far in this direction. It's certainly true that I think, my guess is you'll agree with me on this, that the friends of ours who are too eager to find a fault with our thinking are often lose their status as really good friends. Now, there are, of course, diplomatic and constructive ways to guide people's attention to the problems with their thinking and the problems with their ideas. And I'm a big fan of doing that. I'm starting to wonder whether the concept of critical thinking has the right shape to help us do that properly. I would say this, that I think that the label critical thinking is terrible branding for a really important thing. Almost nobody wants to be a critical person. And when we're trying to help them become better thinkers by saying, hey, guys, come on, let me teach you how to be more critical, a lot of them go, no, thanks. I think there are better ways to brand what we're trying to do. I also think that our focus on critical thinking skills can be problematic because critical thinking skills can be weaponized. You teach people how to slice and dice and rip other people's arguments to shreds, and a lot of them will do that to other people's arguments, to arguments they don't like, but not do the same thing to their own arguments and ideas. So skills alone do not make for fair-mindedness or even good thinking. There are habits of mind and sensibilities that underlie the skills, and if the skills aren't applied by the right kind of attitudes and sensibilities, you can end up with something even more dangerous than you start with. I mean, Steve Bannon uses his critical thinking skills to flood the zone with shit and weaponize disinformation. And I think we need to take seriously the possibility that by teaching critical thinking skills, we're having some unintended consequences. I also wonder whether the mastery of critical thinking skills can exacerbate confirmation bias, right? People who are really good at reasoning can also get really, really good at rationalizing. So how do we prevent that? Can we exacerbate my side bias and the kind of destructive tribalism that's dividing America by teaching critical thinking? I wonder. Now, I don't want to. So I'm done with the critical part of my presentation here. What I'd like to do now is sort of talk about what's the alternative. Now, I would want to mention very briefly that I think that the central alternative offered by popular culture is not adequate to the task. So I believe that something like the idea that there's a marketplace of ideas provides a lot of people with their sort of basic orientation towards the world of information and argumentation. They basically, and they become consumers in what they regard as a vast, I don't know, Costco of the mind, where you wander the aisles and pick out the ideas and arguments that you like, and you populate your mind and your belief system with the info products that suit your fancy. I think this is a terrible metaphor for structuring our thinking, and it's not doing us or our students any good. The fact is, our relationship to ideas and information is not like the relationship between a customer and the products on a Quickie Mart's shelves. So again, what's the alternative? I'm going to tell another story here. In 1994, I believe, I was asked to review a book that had an article by Richard Dawkins called Viruses of the Mind. And in that, Richard floated the idea that bad information can propagate through populations and infect minds. Since then, of course, his observation has become a fledgling field called information epidemiology. Even the World Health Organization now has picked up this idea and begun to, and the fact is, contagion does happen in the world of ideas, just as it happens in the world of biological, world of bodies. It happens to minds as well as bodies. But in this article, Viruses of the Mind, Dawkins makes a passing reference to, he compares children to immune compromised, children's minds. He calls them, he imagines that they're so gullible that it's almost like their minds, immune systems have been compromised. It's just a passing reference, and he went on and didn't go on to develop the idea, but that idea just hit me really hard. And it occurred to me that critical thinking is it's kind of like the mind's immune system. And what I've been talking about and trying to promote for years was really, what I was really trying to do was strengthen the cognitive immune systems of my students. And it seemed to me that just as there's a discipline called information epidemiology, there ought to be a discipline called cognitive immunology. We need to understand how the mind filters information. And it turns out, by the way, that the mind filters information in very much the same way that the body filters out infectious pathogens. Just as the body's immune system generates antibodies to fight off infection, our minds generate antibodies to fight off problematic ideas. And we experience those antibodies as doubts and as questions and challenges. So it turns out that the questioning and the challenging and the argumentation that we love so much, that plays a critical role in protecting minds from bad ideas. And the relevant mechanisms function in ways that are so startlingly like the body's immune system. I think we can learn a ton from studying the body's defenses. And then if we look for the same patterns in the world of minds and information, it turns out you find those same patterns again and again and again. So that's the origins of this field of cognitive immunology that I've spent the last 5 or 10 years trying to create a foundation for. Donna mentioned that I'd written a book. It's called Mental Immunity, and in it, I lay out the case for it. I mean, it's a book I hope my philosophical brothers and sisters will really enjoy and like. And it argues that cognitive immunology can kind of help epistemology become what it's always wanted, what it's always meant to be. We can turn epistemology into a science by availing ourselves of the conceptual tools of that have already been developed over a century by immunologists. Another story. In 1953, the Korean War ended with an armistice, and 9 American prisoners of war were released And instead of returning to the US, they decided to stay in North Korea. And this completely flabbergasted the US intelligence community because they assumed that any good red-blooded American would prefer to move back to the United States. So they jumped quickly to the conclusion that the North Koreans had developed advanced brainwashing techniques. And all of a sudden, there was a panic in the US military establishment. How are we going to counteract the highly advanced brainwashing techniques that the North Koreans, and who knows, maybe the Soviets, have too? They put some money into the study of how do you prevent brainwashing. And one of the recipients of those research grants was a man named William McGuire, who went on to become the president of the American Psychological Association. William McGuire discovered in 1961 that you can inoculate minds against later arriving unwanted information. And he developed something called inoculation theory and has since established a research tradition that now has hundreds of studies showing that you can, in fact, inoculate minds against false information, unwanted information, brainwashing, and things of this kind. Another term for mind inoculation is pre-bunking. So rather than going into a mind that's been infected with lots of bad ideas and trying to disabuse them or debunk their wrong ideas, pre-bunking tries to get there first with a treatment that protects the mind from ever becoming infected in the first place. And it turns out that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure here, that a little bit of pre-bunking can make a whole lot of debunking unnecessary. It's a hell of a lot easier to pre-bunk than to deprogram a cult member. Now, just in the so since my book came out, scholars who work in the inoculation theory tradition have been reaching out to me saying, we think you have a vision here that can turn inoculation theory into something much broader and more powerful. So in the same way that immunology utterly transformed the human condition by freeing us from debilitating diseases, we in the cognitive immunology community now think that the science we're developing could radically reduce human susceptibility to nonsense. Imagine something like the immunology revolution duplicated for the mind or for the community of minds in the same way that vaccine technology, vaccines are literally saved hundreds of millions, billions of lives. What if we could do the same thing? What if we could create a similarly impactful revolution by understanding the mind's immune system and how to make it work better? So that's the premise of our cognitive immunology project and the mission of the research institute, CIRCE, that I run. You may remember that, by the way, Donna, how am I doing for timing? When would be the ideal time to wrap up?
Depends upon how much time you want to leave for questions. I have to vacate the room at 11. It is now 10:27, 10:26.
Gotcha. Okay, so we have another half hour?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll try to I'll run through the last bit here pretty quickly so we can talk. Darwin wrote back in the 1850s that he foresees a future where psychology is placed on a new foundation. And since then, evolutionary psychology, information epidemiology have really started to transform and deepen the insights of psychologists. I think Darwin was absolutely right about that. And I think that just as evolutionary psychology has become a useful contributor. I know it's a controversial discipline, but it's certainly contributed to our understanding of human nature. But now information epidemiology is being used by the World Health Organization to prevent epidemics of health misinformation. That's another Darwinian-inspired discipline that's coming. I think cognitive immunology is going to, and cognitive virology or cognitive parasitology are also going to join those disciplines as part of the emerging Darwinian synthesis in to better understand information dynamics and the world of our minds. The basic premises of this synthesis are pretty simple and pretty straightforward. The basic Darwinian algorithm, create copies of something with variations in them, some of them being fitter than others, and the fitter variants are going to tend to survive. That doesn't just apply to bodies, it also applies to bundles of information. So the memosphere tends to fill up with fitter variants, where fitter doesn't necessarily mean truer, it means better adapted to parasitizing minds in some cases. So we know that the Darwinian algorithm has to operate on information just as it operates on critters. We know that misinformation, falsehoods, false narratives can propagate through populations and derange people. And we might as well call the acquisition of a false narrative a mind infection, if you will. We know that that these mind infections can harm their hosts. And in other words, false narratives, misinformation, bad ideas have all the relevant properties of parasites, mind parasites. And I know it feels icky to talk about mind parasites, and it hits really close to home. And many people get really defensive really fast when you mention this possibility. But there's no question any longer that these Darwinian dynamics do, in fact, shape our thinking. It doesn't mean we don't have any cognitive autonomy. It doesn't mean we're mindless robots pulled around by blind mechanical forces. But those blind mechanical forces are there. And to the extent that we achieve cognitive autonomy and the ability to think freely, it's because we adapt to that reality, not deny it. Key part of the story here is that human beings evolved in worlds full of problematic and sometimes disruptive information, gossip, false narratives, demagogic rhetoric. All of these things were part of the environment that our ancestors had to survive. And so our ancestors had to develop a resistance to the most disruptive and damaging kinds of information. Now, that doesn't mean resistance to the false information. It means resistance to information that is harmful to the bearer. And so the mind had to evolve an immune system, but it's keyed or tuned to fight off threatening information, not necessarily false information. And part of what we're trying to do when we teach critical thinking is to retune the mind's immune system to care about truth, not just what's advantageous for me. And I think reconceptualizing what we're trying to do this way brings clarity and has a lot of power to help us help people become better critical thinkers. So the three basic questions of cognitive immunology are: how does the mind's immune system work? Why do they so frequently fail to weed out falsehood and bad ideas? And how can we make them work better for all of our benefit, for all of our sakes? I think philosophers and critical thinking experts and informal logicians have a ton of relevant expertise that can help cognitive immunology mature into a really powerful discipline that does a lot of good for the world. And so I'm here in part to kind of interest you in this bold new project, sort of Darwinian approach to helping our minds function better, if you will, um, and ask for your help. If you think that these ideas hold water, at least, ask for your help spreading them to other philosophers and critical thinking enthusiasts who can use them. So I'm going to wrap up here, but I'd love to, we should set aside some time here for you to really road test my ideas with tough questions, and I'm eager to hear those. But if I end up persuading you that there's something here, I hope to stay in touch with some of you in the weeks and months to come, because I think that many people with an interest in epistemology, philosophy, critical thinking, logic, um, can find there are wonderful opportunities to take that expertise and have it make a big difference in the world by joining together to strengthen mental immune systems against the worst forms of propaganda and conspiracy thinking and the like. Thank you for your patience, and love to hear what you think.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions. Dale.
Hi, I'm in communications, so I've studied inoculation theory. And the way the inoculation works is topic by topic, actually argument by argument. They say, oh, somebody is going to tell you this wrong thing, and here's what's wrong with what they're going to tell you. And in the context of your talk, that caused me to recognize that there are two large categories of problems. One is for what we're all about. One is content and the other is process. Now, we know how to inoculate against particular bits of content. We don't, as far as I know, have any understanding of how to inoculate against all of the bad content. And it seems to me that ALACT and, affiliated organizations and people are mostly about the process. Whatever the quality of the information, we're trying to get people to operate on it
Yes.
more validly. And I
Dale,
mean,
this is a wonderful question. May I run with this? Because
yes,
you're
please.
spot on this. So inoculation theorists distinguish between, I think, content-based inoculation, where you refute particular facts one by one, and doing that is like playing whack-a-mole. There's so many possible bad ideas and that need to be shot down that it's hard to scale fact-based inoculation because you're running around offering inoculations to lots and lots of specific things. But inoculation theorists also look at, what do they call it? Sort of method-based inoculation. Like it's basically an attempt to look at broad classes of mistakes, like fallacies, and say, hey, these are things we need to inoculate against entire classes. We need broad spectrum immunity enhancers, not just narrow spectrum ones. And immunologists use the exact same language. You can inoculate against a very particular variant of COVID, but a better vaccine would inoculate against a broad range of COVID variants. And the exact same problem arises when you teach.
Yeah, and in our case, we would of course like to immunize people against fallacies. But the trouble is, we did that for about 2 or 3 years in the 1970s and started thinking about it more and realized that for every fallacy scheme, there are perfectly good arguments that fit it. So what, maybe we need a meta theory of fallacies or something like that, but
Yeah.
I don't see that we are in a position to intelligently immunize against thinking by analogy or depending on the opinions of other people or ignoring correlations when we think about causality. I mean, none of that works, I think.
You're quite right that uh, it gets very complicated very fast. And some of the shining examples of vaccines almost seem like magic bullets, right? The smallpox
Yeah.
vaccine
Mhm.
seemed like a magic bullet that suddenly solved. And I don't want to claim that there are magic bullets out there in terms of cognitive vaccines, mind vaccines. But I do think that by focusing on broad classes of cognitive errors, by looking at the methods, incorrect methods of arriving at conclusions, if you can teach a student that we often confuse correlation with causation, you confer a broad spectrum kind of immunity to a broad range of mistakes. So there's my kind of my one of my primary examples. You don't have to go down and debunk or pre-bunk against each specific case of post hoc ergo propter hoc. You can teach somebody to be on the lookout for for incorrect inferences from correlation to causation. And then, of course, encourage them to use their judgment, because there will be interesting cases that there are some inferences from correlation to causation that are good and that should be made. And so simple rules, I don't have any simple way to reduce this to a set of rules. And I don't want to take away the hard work of exercising judgment in the application of whatever rules of thumb we offer. Yeah, I mean, knowledge of how fallacies work requires that you have to apply that knowledge with judgment and discrimination. And there's no substitute for that judgment. But we can cultivate better judgment, I think, in part by helping people understand that their minds are our minds are easily infected, and that we actually have to be active about trying to spot the mind bugs and ward them off. I hope that helps, Dale. I think we're on the same page here.
Yeah, yeah, interesting discussion.
Sharon?
Sure.
Thank you very much for that talk. A lot to think about. First of all, a comment about your response to Dale, because some of the kinds of, I guess, technique strategies you're talking about in terms of developing cognitive immunity to these broader classes of problematic kinds of thinking, I think are what are done in typical critical thinking courses already. I mean,
Yeah.
just but also I want to ask a broader question about the conception of critical thinking that you were seem to be the basis of your critique at the beginning, which was critical thinking is fault finding. And I think that many people, some people anyway in the field, would argue that's much too narrow a conception of critical thinking, and that actually what they're trying to do is something like what I would call developing reasoned judgment, which goes, so the critique of just fault finding is appropriate, I think, but many of us are trying to teach critical thinking as reasoned judgments, which involves comparatively evaluating arguments, not just critiquing others' arguments.
Yeah.
Also,
fair point, Sharon. I hear you loud and clear.
And you alluded to basically some of the virtues, open-mindedness and fair-mindedness, which again are considered to be important virtues to develop in critical thinking. So I think some of your critiques are, in terms of a narrow view of critical thinking is fault finding, are appropriate, but the field is much broader, and I think a lot of what goes on actually might be quite amenable to or not inconsistent with some of the things you're arguing.
Sharon, I think that's exactly right. And if I seem to be the argument I gave certainly would not have counted as a fair argument against everything that goes on under the banner of critical thinking, right? It's a very particular way of a particular and somewhat narrow form of fault finding via and dissecting arguments that I mean to criticize, and so no, I don't mean to in any way impugn most of what goes on in critical thinking. in critical thinking instruction, critical thinking theory. I will say this, though, that I think some of the objections I raised, some of the concerns I raised have to do with the language we use, critical, and whether that's really serving us well. We've been trying to promote critical thinking for about 100 years now. What percentage of the population actually have we managed to turn into good thinkers? And is that really enough, especially in a highly interconnected digital world? Or do we need a new approach that acknowledges all of the good and all of the what was right about critical thinking, but tries to reframe it in a way that makes it even more powerful and helpful than before? So I probably came across as more critical of the critical thinking tradition than maybe I should have, especially given that there are different definitions of the term. But I did want to problematize the way we're talking about it and the way many people understand the word critical and the way it's taken up. Even if by critical thinking we mean fair-minded thinking, I think many people get the wrong idea and go off and become fault finders.
Thank you. We have Stuart, then Gilbert, then Frank. Stuart?
Yeah, thanks. This is really interesting. I've not come across this before, so it's really, really good to hear about. One feature of the problems in people's thinking and beliefs is to do with their social context, right down to the point where, you know, it's almost going to be more sensible to believe a certain thing because it prevents social ostracism, being socially ostracized, say. How does that fit with your immunology analogy?
Yeah. Well, so I think in the evolutionary story is pretty easy to lay out. It was important for our ancestors to remain in good standing in the tribes they belonged to, the clans they evolved with. So conformity to the views of others and groupthink and proneness to groupthink would both have been adaptive to a certain degree. But of course, those are in tension with or often frustrate our search for the truth or our truth for genuine understanding of one another. So I think some of the social instincts that lead us to think poorly are some of the biggest distortions out there. And I really like the way of thinking about it that says, well, our mind's filtration systems evolved to protect our tribal allegiances. And that often gets us into trouble when it causes us to deny the truth. In fact, we're reaching a point in human evolution, I think, where we need to retune, again, our mind's immune systems from, is this helpful to me, or is this helpful to my tribe? Retune it so that we filter beliefs based on truth and falsehood, and rather than, is it helpful or harmful to my tribe?
Mm.
Gilbert?
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering how what I regard as the following fact fits into your picture. I taught philosophy for 10 years, and I taught, informal logic, intro to logic, critical thinking courses. I also taught a lot of intro to philosophy courses. And I always thought that the intro to philosophy courses that had a lot of papers produced better thinkers than the course, the intro to logic course. And of course, the big difference is there is the meta approach of the informal logic courses, and then there's the actual doing, the object level approach of intro to philosophy. So I guess I'm wondering your reaction to this relative to your conceptual schemes, and how much of your program involves sort of the meta level on the part of the student looking at his or her thinking.
Yeah, I do think metacognition is really important. So I think a healthy cognitive immune system requires that you be able to think about your thinking and correct when you have reason to think your thinking might be going off base. Um, your question, I like you, I taught pretty much the same slate of courses you just listed that you used to teach. And my real bread and butter, the one I really grew to love, was Intro to Philosophy. And when I started teaching Introduction to Philosophy, I came out of grad school, highly competitive graduate school, where the ability to win in a to win a discursive contestation was highly valued. I showed up as a young professor wanting to get my students interested in competitive argumentation. And I realized that was not helping. It wasn't helping them. I was not doing them any favors. And I had to completely overhaul my approach to the point where I would build a community of inquiry where we would all collaborate to find the truth together. We had to change the game from a fundamentally competitive one to a fundamentally cooperative one. And that had transformative effects. And it leads me to be somewhat, it's not as though critical thinking as traditionally conceived is wedded to the idea that argumentation should be combative or but I think it's often taken up that way. And I want to promote, I think it does students a lot more good to learn how to think together collaboratively while testing each other's ideas in a friendly way. And help them see that you don't have to damage your relationships I mean, look, we're all blind to our own mind bugs. Our mind bugs always seem like right, true ideas. We need the help of others to spot our mind infections because we're fundamentally blind to them, or almost always blind to them at least. So we need to approach discursive idea testing with the idea, thank you for challenging me on that, because I never thought about it that way. And I'm really grateful that you're opening my eyes to a possible shortcoming of one of these ideas that's become important to me. That spirit has to infuse dialectical idea testing, I think, to really serve our students well. And I think that's in the background of I think a lot of the best critical thinking instructors and informal logicians know that and promote it. But I myself failed to integrate that stuff sufficiently early on in my teaching career. And I paid a price for it with some terrible course evaluations, among other things. But I think I was able to self-correct to some degree.
Thank you. So Frank, did you have a question before we wrap up?
Well, I'm sensitive to time, so let me just run through a couple of things. One, I couldn't help but think when describing cognitive immunology that I can imagine myself early on in the critical thinking course as explaining to students that what we're about is enhancing their immune response.
Yes.
And using that analogy as something they could grab hold of and say, oh, okay, well, that actually sounds like a good idea, because we all know there's bad ideas and good ideas, and you want to repel the bad ideas and let the good ideas in. So I think it's a useful metaphor from a pedagogical standpoint.
Good.
Second, out of book recommendation, Cecilia Hayes, Cognitive Gadgets. He's a fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. And I just read this a while back. And if you're thinking about cultural evolutionary psychology, she's the best person I've come across so far that actually tries to sketch what's inside the black box that's operating in terms of cognitive mechanisms. So I actually think it's really worth encountering. Third and last comment, I was waiting as reading your book to get to the notion of the burden of proof, which finally on 316, I see you say things like, it's really important. Because when I was teaching critical thinking, it always seemed to me that it was important to stress the principles that ask what's the requisite burden of proof in this particular case, because it shifts. And then I used to think in terms of things like what's at stake. Well, the more that's at stake, you want higher standard of evidence. Very little's at stake. What the heck? You can just rely on gossip. But also, what evidence is realistically available within the time frame? D-Day, Eisenhower's D-Day decision always stands to me as a premier example of that. What's the weather going to be like? Well, we got some information. We sure like a lot more, but we can't get it in time. We have to make a decision. So I
Beautiful.
think, thinking along the lines of the burden of proof and that balance helped me at least conceptualize what was necessary. And I tried to convey that, of course, to my students. So let me that's comments and not questions.
But all music to my ears, though, Frank. Thank you.
You bet.
I love it.
Thank you, Andy, for being here. I really appreciate it when I reached out to you to invite you, and it was such a prompt and welcome response.
My pleasure.
Anything else? Kevin?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I just want to quickly second Sharon's point about the way you started things, about putting the accent on critical. That is that might apply to some places, but it's kind of a straw man characterization of a lot of courses being taught in critical thinking. And I think another, putting the accent on teaching cognitive biases, teaching fallacies, that sort of thing. Just telling students what not to do just leaves them hanging. And I think you're absolutely right. That makes skeptics out of all of them. Well, geez, all I hear about is what not to do. I don't know what the hell to do, so I'm not going to do anything. So you do really have to, following Sharon's point, you do have to tell them what makes for good evidence, what makes for justified belief, what makes for a good argument. And you got to lay that out. And I think, for example, Trudy Govier in A Practical Study of Argument does a really nice job of laying out what makes for a cogent argument, her ARS conditions: acceptable premises, relevant to supporting the conclusion, and sufficiently supporting the conclusion to the point where it makes the conclusion at least probably true. Mm-hmm. And that's then along the way of discussing that and applying that, that is her way of analyzing classic informal fallacies to discuss what makes them fallacies in the first place. Otherwise, talking about cognitive biases, fallacy, it just looks like a goofy ass grab bag of don't do these. And she really organizes them pretty well in terms of her cogency conditions. And that tells students, here's how to construct a good argument. Not all arguments suck. This is the way to do it. And
beautiful.
That kind of direction. And that makes them, not critical, but just insisting that, look, we're hunting for the truth here and trying to avoid error. And this is the most probable way of pulling that off. And I think that's where the accent needs to be.
I hear you, Kevin, and I love what you're saying. I think that's right. I want to apologize for either straw manning or seeming to straw man the critical thinking tradition. It's not that I want to impugn it. I want to enlist the enthusiastic assistance of critical thinking experts to take it beyond what we could ever thought possible. And I think part of this involves tweaking our language use in ways that helps students become enthusiastic about this process. It's hard to get students excited about critical thinking, but it might be easier to get them excited about mental immunity, right? So it's partially just a rebranding effort. And I don't want to invalidate anything you guys have been doing in your classes and so on. I want to say, hey, there's a future out there where we can do what we've been trying to do for a century, but we can do it even better. Let's integrate these Darwinian notions with the best advice of critical thinking experts and informal logicians, and we're going to arrive at a set of principles of cognitive immunology that are going to make it much, much easier to help students become capable critical thinkers.
Well, thank you very much. On that note, I think I will call this presentation to a close. I really appreciate everybody being here. I will have this on our website probably by the end of the day today. So thank you again, Andy Norman. This has been wonderful. Thank you everybody for showing up, and take care.
Donna, one
Thank you
thing,
much.
real
Yes.
quick. Thank you all. I don't know if you guys have noticed in the chat, but I've provided some links there if you'd like to learn more, for people who'd like to learn more, or reach out to me so that we could maybe work to collaborate in some capacity to help spread these ideas. If you want to just copy the contents of that chat thing, you'll have access to a lot of interesting stuff, and I'd love to hear from you later.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so very much. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks much.
Thanks.
Good job, Donna.
Thank you.